The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed buzzed like angry wasps, casting everything in that sickly green pallor that makes even healthy people look half dead. I could taste copper in my mouth, blood, fear, or maybe just the metallic tang of the IV drip that had been my constant companion for 3 days now. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I was discovering that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who destroy you most completely. The pain in my left side felt like someone had reached inside me and carved out a piece of my soul with a rusty spoon. Dr. Martinez stood at the foot of my bed, his weathered hands clasping a manila folder that might as well have contained my death sentence. Behind him, my mother, Maria, sat in the visitor's chair, her fingers worrying about the rosary beads she always carried, the same ones her own mother had brought from Guadalajara 50 years ago. Those beads had witnessed countless prayers, countless promises to saints who apparently weren't listening anymore. Elena, I need you to understand what happened during your surgery, Dr. Martinez said, his voice carrying that careful, professional tone doctors use when they're about to shatter your world. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny angels, oblivious to the hell being unleashed below them. The appendectomy went well, but during our routine post-operative examination, we discovered something unusual. My mother's beads clicked faster, a nervous rhythm that matched the accelerated beeping of my heart monitor. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and that was when I knew. In that instant before Dr. Martinez spoke the words that would change everything, I already knew. The way she held her shoulders too straight, the way her lips moved in silent prayer, the way she'd been avoiding my direct questions about why I felt so different, so empty. Elena, you're missing a kidney. Your left kidney was surgically removed at some point in the past several months. The scar tissue indicates it was a professional operation, likely performed in a medical facility. The world tilted sideways. The ceiling became the floor became nothing, and I was falling through space, while somehow still lying perfectly still in that narrow hospital bed. Missing a kidney. The words didn't make sense, like someone had taken a sentence in English and scrambled all the letters. I touched my side, feeling along the faint scar I'd noticed months ago, the one my mother had told me was from when I fell off my bike as a child. "That's impossible," I whispered. But even as I said it, memories were shifting, rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces finally finding their correct positions. The unexplained trip to Tijuana 6 months ago, when my mother said we were visiting her sister Carmen. The way I'd felt so drowsy during that visit, sleeping for almost 2 entire days. Carmen's nervous laughter when I asked why there were so many medical supplies in her bathroom. The strange tenderness in my back that lasted for weeks afterward. "Mija," my mother finally spoke, and her voice cracked like old leather. "I can explain." But could she? Could anyone explain how a mother sells her daughter's organ like it was a piece of furniture at a garage sale? Could anyone justify trading flesh and blood for money, trading your child's future health for whatever desperate need drove you to such unthinkable betrayal?
The silence stretched between us like a chasm. In that silence, I could hear everything. The distant sound of other families in other rooms dealing with their own medical crises, the hum of machines keeping people alive, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. But loudest of all was the sound of my own heartbeat. Irregular now, panicked, as if my body was finally understanding what had been stolen from it. Maria's rosary beads slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. She bent to retrieve them, and when she straightened, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "We needed the money," she whispered. "Your father, he owes people, bad people. They were going to hurt us, hurt you. Carmen, she knew someone who could help." The room spun around me like I was trapped in a snow globe that some cosmic child had shaken too hard. "You sold my kidney?" The words came out flat, emotionless, because my brain couldn't yet process the magnitude of what I was hearing. You drugged me and sold my kidney. $40,000, she said, and the amount hit me like a physical blow. It was enough to pay off Papa's debts and have something left over for your college fund. You were going to study nursing, remember? You wanted to help people. I thought this would help you help people. The logic was so twisted, so fundamentally broken that I actually laughed. It was a sound like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. You thought stealing my organ would help me become a nurse. You thought violating my body would somehow benefit me. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his medical training clearly not having prepared him for this particular family drama. I'm going to have to report this to the authorities. What you're describing is multiple felonies: assault, medical fraud, human trafficking. My mother's face went white as the hospital sheets. No, please. Elena, tell him you don't want to press charges. Tell him it was consensual. But I was done telling lies for her. I was done pretending that love justified betrayal, that desperation excused destruction. Get out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying all the force of a hurricane. Get out of my room! Get out of my life! Elena, por favor! Get out! The scream tore from my throat like it was ripping away part of my soul. Nurses came running, security was called, and my mother was escorted from the building while she sobbed my name like a prayer that would never be answered. I was left alone with Dr. Martinez, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the space of 10 minutes. "Will you be all right?" he asked, though we both knew it was a stupid question. Was anyone all right after discovering their mother had sold their organs? Was there a medical protocol for processing that level of betrayal? Will I be okay? Medically, I mean. Can I live normally with one kidney? He nodded, settling into the chair my mother had vacated. Many people live completely normal lives with one kidney. You'll need to be more careful about certain medications, avoid contact sports, stay hydrated, but yes, you can live a full, healthy life. A full, healthy life. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was discovering I could live fully with half my kidneys, but apparently couldn't live at all with a mother who saw my body as her personal bank account. As Dr. Martinez left to make his reports and I was alone with my thoughts, I stared out the window at the city sprawling below. Somewhere out there, a stranger was walking around with my kidney, probably completely unaware of the family destruction their medical emergency had caused.
I closed my eyes and tried to imagine forgiveness. I tried to picture a world where I could understand my mother's desperation, where I could see past the betrayal to the love that supposedly motivated it. But all I could see was that hospital room in Tijuana, where I'd been unconscious and vulnerable while someone cut into me and took something that could never be replaced. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the flowers my mother used to plant in our tiny garden. She taught me their names in both English and Spanish, her hands gentle as she showed me how to water them without drowning their roots. Those same hands had signed papers authorizing the removal of my kidney. Those same hands had counted out money while I was healing from surgery I never consented to. As night fell over the hospital, I made a promise to myself. I would rebuild my life from scratch, kidney by kidney, choice by choice. I would never again allow anyone to make decisions about my body without my consent. And most importantly, I would never forgive the woman who had given me life and then sold pieces of it back to the highest bidder. But promises made in hospital rooms, I would later learn, are easier to make than to keep. And karma, that cosmic force that balances all scales, was already preparing its own twisted sense of justice. 3 months after that devastating revelation, I was living in a studio apartment on the wrong side of town, working double shifts at a diner called Mel's Place, where the coffee was always burnt and the customers always seemed to be running from something. The apartment was barely larger than my childhood bedroom, with walls so thin I could hear Mrs. Chen next door practicing violin at all hours, and Mr. Rodriguez below me having heated phone conversations with his ex-wife. But it was mine. Every cracked tile, every flickering light bulb, every cockroach that scurried across the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. belonged to me and me alone. My daily routine had become a meditation in independence. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of garbage trucks rumbling down Maple Street, their hydraulic whines mixing with the early morning calls of vendors setting up their stalls at the farmer's market 3 blocks away. I'd make coffee in the tiny percolator I'd bought at a thrift store, the one with the chipped handle that burned my fingers if I wasn't careful. While the coffee brewed, I'd stretch beside my single window that looked out onto the fire escape, where someone had planted tomatoes in old paint cans, their green vines reaching toward whatever sunlight managed to filter down between the surrounding buildings. The work at Mel's was honest in a way nothing in my previous life had been. When someone ordered eggs over easy, I gave them eggs over easy. When they wanted their coffee hot, I made sure the mug was warm before I poured. There were no hidden agendas, no secret surgeries, no family members plotting to sell my internal organs while I slept. Just simple transactions between people who were all trying to get through another day. Mel Rodriguez, the owner, was a 60-something Cuban immigrant whose weathered hands told the story of 40 years in restaurant kitchens. He'd hired me despite my complete lack of experience, probably because I was willing to work for minimum wage and didn't ask questions about why he paid in cash. Mel had left his homeland with nothing but the recipe for his grandmother's black beans and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. He never asked why a young woman with college ambitions was slinging hash at his diner instead of sitting in lecture halls, and I never volunteered the information. "Elena, table 4 needs more napkins," called Rosa, the other waitress, a 40-year-old single mother who'd been working at Mel's since her oldest daughter was in elementary school. Rosa had 3 kids, 2 jobs, and somehow still managed to send money back to her mother in Honduras. She wore her exhaustion like a badge of honor, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of late nights helping with homework and early mornings packing lunches. I grabbed a stack of napkins and headed to table 4, where an elderly man sat alone reading a newspaper, his arthritic fingers struggling with the thin pages. He came in every morning at exactly 7:15, ordered the same thing, black coffee, wheat toast, no butter, and left the exact same tip, $2.37. I'd asked Mel about him once and learned his name was Frank Kowalski, a retired postal worker whose wife had died 3 years ago. He came to Mel's because eating breakfast at home reminded him too much of the empty chair across from his kitchen table. "Here you go, Mr. Kowalski," I said, placing the napkins beside his coffee cup. He looked up at me with pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than most people's, and nodded his thanks. There was something comforting about his routine, his predictability. In a world where mothers could sell your organs without warning, there was something deeply reassuring about a man who showed up every day for the same breakfast at the same time.
The lunch rush brought its own chaos. Construction workers from the site down the street, their hard hats and safety vests bright against the diner's faded vinyl booths. Office workers grabbing quick sandwiches before rushing back to jobs they probably hated. High school kids cutting class, pooling their change to split orders of fries and pretending they were more sophisticated than they actually were. I moved between tables with mechanical efficiency, taking orders, delivering food, clearing dishes, my body learning the rhythms of service while my mind processed the strange new reality of my life. During my break, I'd sit out back by the dumpster and call my friend Sophia, the only person from my old life who still spoke to me. Sophia had been my roommate in community college before everything fell apart, a pre-med student whose own family had sacrificed everything to pay for her education. She was working toward becoming a pediatrician, driven by memories of her younger brother who died from leukemia when she was 16. "Have you talked to your mother?" she asked during one of our daily calls, her voice crackling through my cheap phone. "No." The answer was always the same. "I have nothing to say to her." "Elena, I know what she did was unforgivable, but she's still your mother. She's been calling me, you know. She's worried about you." I watched a stray cat pick through the garbage behind the Chinese restaurant next door, its orange fur matted and dirty, but its movements still graceful, still dignified despite its circumstances. "She should have worried about me before she sold my kidney." "I know, but nothing, Sophia. There is no but big enough to excuse what she did. She violated my body. She made medical decisions for me while I was unconscious. She took away my choice, my autonomy, my trust. There's no coming back from that."
Sophia sighed, and I could picture her sitting in whatever cramped study space she'd claimed at the medical school library, surrounded by textbooks about human anatomy, probably looking at diagrams of kidneys and thinking about our conversation. I just think you might regret not talking to her. What if something happens? What if she gets sick? Or then she'll have to deal with it the same way I had to deal with waking up missing an organ. I hung up before she could respond. These conversations with Sophia were becoming harder. She meant well, but she couldn't understand. Her parents had sold everything they owned to support her dreams. Mine had sold my body parts to pay off gambling debts. Evenings were the loneliest time. I'd come home to my studio apartment, heat up a can of soup or make pasta with whatever vegetables I could afford, and try to pretend I wasn't listening for footsteps in the hallway, for a knock on my door that never came. Sometimes I'd catch myself expecting to hear my mother's voice calling my name, the way she used to when I was younger and would lose track of time reading in my bedroom. My mother had always been dramatic, prone to grand gestures and emotional outbursts that made our small house feel even smaller. When I was 8, she'd surprised me by repainting my entire bedroom while I was at school, transforming it from boring white to a vibrant purple with hand-painted stars on the ceiling. When I was 12 and struggling with math, she'd hired a tutor we couldn't afford rather than let me fail. When I was 16 and heartbroken over my first boyfriend, she'd driven 3 hours to the beach so we could walk along the water and talk about how love was supposed to feel like coming home, not like losing yourself. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, like scenes from a movie I'd watched but never actually lived. How could the same woman who had painted stars on my ceiling have drugged me and arranged for my kidney to be removed? How could someone who claimed to love me have treated my body like collateral for her husband's mistakes? At night, lying on my secondhand mattress and listening to the sounds of the city settling into sleep, I'd touch the scar on my left side and wonder about the person who had my kidney. Were they grateful? Did they know how it had been obtained? Were they living a full, healthy life while I served coffee and tried to pretend I wasn't fundamentally broken?
The physical healing had been easier than the emotional damage. Dr. Martinez had been right. I could live normally with one kidney. I drank more water, avoided aspirin, wore a medical alert bracelet that felt like a permanent reminder of my mother's betrayal. But the deeper wounds, the ones that cut through trust and family and the basic assumption that the people who love you won't hurt you, those seemed to have no healing timeline. I'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who worked at a community health center and charged on a sliding scale based on income. Dr. Chen was maybe 40, with kind eyes and a way of asking questions that made you think she actually cared about the answers. Her office was small but warm, filled with plants and books and a tissue box that never seemed to run empty. Trauma changes our relationship with our bodies, she'd told me during one of our sessions. When someone violates your physical boundaries, especially someone you trust, it can make you feel like your body isn't really yours anymore. That resonated in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. My body didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like something that could be taken apart and sold, something that belonged more to other people's needs and desires than to my own choices. Learning to trust my own instincts again, to believe that I had the right to make decisions about my own flesh and blood, was harder than any physical recovery. But I was learning. Every day, I chose what to eat, where to go, how to spend my time. I was reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. Every paycheck I earned with my own hands, every bill I paid with my own money, every decision I made without consulting anyone else, these were victories, small but significant. Sometimes, walking home from work in the evening light, I'd catch myself feeling something that might have been happiness. Not the complicated, conditional happiness of family relationships, but something simpler and cleaner. The satisfaction of work honestly done, the pride of independence earned through struggle, the quiet joy of a life that belonged entirely to me. Those moments never lasted long. They were interrupted by memories, by dreams where I woke up on an operating table while strangers discussed the market value of my organs, by the persistent ache in my left side that reminded me daily of what I'd lost. But they were growing more frequent, these glimpses of a life that might be worth living on its own terms.
6 months into my new life, I had developed what Dr. Chen called hypervigilance, a state where every unexpected phone call, every knock on my door, every stranger who looked at me too long became a potential threat. I changed my phone number twice, blocked my mother on every social media platform I could think of, and still I felt like I was being watched, hunted, tracked by people who saw me as nothing more than a collection of valuable parts. The first sign that my carefully constructed independence was under assault came on a Thursday morning when I arrived at Mel's to find a woman in an expensive suit sitting in the corner booth sipping coffee and checking her phone with the kind of casual authority that marked her as someone used to getting what she wanted. She was maybe 50, with perfectly styled blonde hair and manicured nails that had never seen dish soap or cleaning supplies. Everything about her screamed money and power, and the kind of entitlement that could rearrange other people's lives to suit her convenience. "Elena Vasquez?" she asked as I walked past her table, and my blood turned to ice water. Nobody knew my name here except Mel and Rosa and the regular customers who'd learned it over months of serving them coffee. Nobody in expensive suits had any reason to know who I was. "I'm sorry, you must have me confused with someone else," I said. But my voice betrayed me, cracking like I was 13 again and lying about breaking my mother's favorite vase. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile wolves probably wore right before they tore into their prey. "Please sit down. My name is Victoria Hartwell, and I represent the Hartwell Medical Foundation. I think we need to talk."
The world tilted sideways the same way it had in the hospital when Dr. Martinez first told me about my missing kidney. I gripped the back of the empty chair across from her, my knuckles going white as I tried to process what was happening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. You're living with my husband's kidney, Miss Vasquez, the kidney that was purchased through irregular channels in Tijuana 6 months ago, the kidney that saved Richard Hartwell's life when the traditional transplant waiting lists proved too slow for our needs." I sat down hard, my legs giving out underneath me. The diner around us continued its normal morning rhythm. Mel flipping pancakes on the grill, Rosa refilling coffee cups, the construction workers arguing about baseball scores. But I felt like I was trapped in a bubble where only this conversation existed, where only this nightmare was real. "Your husband has my kidney," I whispered. "Richard was dying of kidney disease. He's a prominent businessman, a philanthropist, a pillar of our community. He had months to live, maybe weeks. The waiting list for legal organ donations would have taken years we didn't have." She spoke matter-of-factly, like she was discussing a real estate transaction instead of talking about my stolen organ. "We paid for medical services. What your family chose to do with that payment was their decision, not ours." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. This woman, this stranger in her expensive clothes and perfect makeup, was sitting in a diner in the poorest part of town talking about my stolen organ like it was a business transaction that had simply gotten a little messy around the edges. Her husband was walking around with a piece of my body while I scraped together enough money for rent and groceries. "Why are you here?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. "Richard's body is rejecting the transplant. His doctors say he needs another kidney, preferably from the same donor for the best chance of compatibility." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a persuasive tone. "We're prepared to offer you $500,000 for your remaining kidney." The silence that followed her words was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. $500,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to pay for medical school, enough to buy a house, enough to completely transform my life. All I had to do was give up my last kidney and spend the rest of my life on dialysis, dependent on machines and medical schedules, and the charity of a healthcare system that saw people like me as disposable. "You want me to sell you my only remaining kidney so your husband can live while I die slowly on dialysis," I said, my voice flat and emotionless because if I let any feeling into it, I was going to start screaming and never stop. "Not die," Victoria corrected, as if the distinction mattered. People live for years on dialysis. And we'd make sure you had the best medical care, the finest facilities. You'd never want for anything. Except freedom, except health, except the ability to live my life on my own terms instead of being chained to a machine 3 days a week for the rest of my existence. Her smile faltered slightly, the first crack in her perfect composure. It's a generous offer, Miss Vasquez, much more than your family received for the first kidney. And there it was, the casual admission that she knew exactly how my kidney had been obtained, that she'd been aware from the beginning that I'd never consented to any of this. She'd paid money to people she knew were violating my body, and now she wanted to complete the transaction by purchasing the rest of me piece by piece. Get out, I said, my voice quiet but carrying all the force of a hurricane building strength. Get out of here before I call the police.
Victoria Hartwell laughed, and it was the sound of someone who'd never had to worry about consequences, who'd never had to wonder where her next meal was coming from or whether she could afford her rent. The police? Ms. Vasquez, do you really think the authorities are going to care about the complaints of a waitress against one of the city's most prominent families? Richard sits on the hospital board. He's donated millions to law enforcement charities. He has dinner with judges and senators. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt with hands that had never done a day's honest labor, and placed a business card on the table between us. Think about our offer. $500,000. It's more money than you'll ever see working in places like this. She gestured dismissively at the diner around us, at Mel's life work, at the place that had given me dignity and purpose when my own family had stripped both away. Call me when you come to your senses. After she left, I sat in that booth for 20 minutes, staring at her business card like it was a snake that might strike if I moved too quickly. Victoria Hartwell, Director, Hartwell Medical Foundation. Below her name was an address in the most expensive part of the city, the kind of neighborhood where people had drivers and housekeepers and probably never gave a second thought to the cost of medical care. "Everything okay, mija?" Mel asked, sliding into the seat across from me. He'd been watching the conversation from behind the counter, his weathered face creased with concern. That woman looked like trouble. "She wants to buy my remaining kidney," I said. The words sounded insane even as I spoke them. The woman whose husband already has my other kidney wants to buy the one I have left. Mel's expression darkened. He'd immigrated from Cuba as a young man, had seen enough corruption and exploitation to recognize it when it walked into his diner wearing designer clothes. "What'd you tell her?" "I told her to get out." He nodded approvingly, then reached across the table to squeeze my hand with his calloused fingers. "Good. Rich people, they think everything is for sale. They think they can buy dignity, buy health, buy other people's bodies, like we're all just spare parts waiting to be harvested." His voice carried the weight of decades spent watching powerful people crush those who couldn't fight back. "You don't owe them nothing, Elena. Not your kidney, not your life, nothing." But even as I nodded agreement, I couldn't stop thinking about the number. $500,000. Enough to disappear, to start over somewhere else, to buy a new identity and a new life far away from mothers who sold their daughters' organs and rich people who treated human bodies like inventory. Enough to matter in a world that had made it very clear I was disposable. The rest of my shift passed in a haze. I took orders and delivered food and cleared tables, but my mind was spinning through possibilities and consequences. What would happen if I said no? Would the Hartwells leave me alone, or would they find other ways to pressure me? What would happen if I said yes? Could I really spend the rest of my life tethered to dialysis machines, dependent on medical schedules, never again able to travel or take risks or live spontaneously? That evening, I called Dr. Chen and made an emergency appointment. Her office felt like a sanctuary.
the plants and soft lighting a stark contrast to the harsh, fluorescent reality of the diner and Victoria Hartwell's predatory smile. "Someone wants to buy my remaining kidney," I said, without preamble, sinking into the familiar chair across from her desk. "The woman whose husband already has my first kidney wants to buy the one I have left." Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but I saw her grip her pen a little tighter. "How do you feel about that?" Terrified, angry, tempted. The last admission came out in a whisper because acknowledging that I was even considering it felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been trying to rebuild. "Is that crazy? Am I insane for even thinking about it?"
She was right. By evening, the Hartwell family's response machine was in full swing. Richard Hartwell himself appeared on the 6 o'clock news looking pale and fragile in his hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that were apparently keeping him alive while his body rejected my stolen kidney. "I had no knowledge of how my kidney was obtained," he said, his voice weak but his eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that had built a medical empire. "My wife Victoria handled all the arrangements through what I believed were legitimate medical channels. I am as horrified as anyone to learn that Miss Vasquez was victimized in this process." It was a masterful performance, painting him as another victim of his wife's alleged crimes while positioning himself as a dying man who couldn't be held responsible for decisions made by others during his medical crisis. Victoria Hartwell, meanwhile, had seemingly vanished. Her lawyers released a statement denying all allegations and promising a vigorous legal defense, but she hadn't been seen in public since Marcus's article broke. The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, legal meetings, and the surreal experience of watching my private trauma become public property. I appeared on 3 different news programs, sat for interviews with 2 major newspapers, and met with FBI agents who were now investigating the organ trafficking network that Marcus had exposed. Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, just one of those cosmic coincidences that make life feel scripted, was a compact woman in her 40s with the kind of focused intensity that made you believe she could stare down corruption until it confessed. She came to my apartment on a Thursday morning with a partner and a briefcase full of documents that apparently detailed a criminal enterprise spanning 3 countries. "Miss Vasquez, what you've helped us uncover is bigger than just your kidney," she told me, spreading photographs and financial records across my tiny kitchen table. "The Hartwell Medical Foundation has been facilitating illegal organ sales for at least 5 years. We've identified dozens of victims, millions of dollars in illegal payments, and a network of doctors and brokers who've been trafficking human organs across international borders." I stared at the photographs. Medical facilities in Mexico, bank statements showing wire transfers, what looked like shipping manifests with coded language that probably referred to human organs. How many people like me are there? At least 40 that we've identified so far, probably more. Young people from poor families, immigrants who don't speak English well, people who were vulnerable and desperate and had family members willing to sell their organs without their consent. The scope of it was overwhelming. I thought my situation was unique, a horrible but isolated incident of family betrayal and medical exploitation. But I was just one victim in a vast criminal enterprise that had been treating human beings like livestock, harvesting our organs to keep rich people alive. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we build cases. Criminal cases against the Hartwells, against the doctors who performed illegal surgeries, against the brokers who facilitated the sales. Civil cases to recover damages for the victims, and we try to shut down the network before more people get hurt." That afternoon, Victoria Hartwell was arrested at a private airport as she attempted to board a jet bound for Switzerland. The footage of her being led away in handcuffs, her perfect blonde hair disheveled and her designer outfit wrinkled, was played on every news channel for the rest of the day.
She'd been caught with suitcases full of cash and documents that apparently detailed the organ trafficking operation in meticulous detail. Richard Hartwell died 3 days later, his body finally rejecting my kidney completely while his immune system attacked the foreign organ that had never truly belonged to him. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd built his medical empire on treating human beings as spare parts had been killed by his own body's rejection of stolen flesh. I should have felt vindicated, or at least satisfied that cosmic justice had been served. But mostly I felt empty, hollowed out by the realization that his death didn't give me back my kidney or repair the damage that had been done to my family or undo the months of fear and harassment I'd endured. Death, I was learning, was a poor substitute for accountability. The funeral was a spectacle, covered by news crews who seemed more interested in the criminal charges than in mourning the deceased. I watched from my apartment as politicians and business leaders who'd been friends with the Hartwells suddenly discovered urgent reasons to be elsewhere, their loyalty evaporating like morning dew when faced with federal investigations and public outrage. Meanwhile, my own life was transforming in ways I couldn't have imagined. The interview requests kept coming, but now they were different, less sensational, more substantive. Advocacy groups wanted me to speak at conferences about organ trafficking. Medical schools invited me to share my story with students who needed to understand the human cost of corruption in healthcare. A literary agent called to ask if I'd considered writing a book. More importantly, other victims were reaching out. Through social media, through the FBI, through Marcus Rivera's continued reporting, I was connecting with people who'd experienced similar violations. Maria Santos, whose teenage son had been coerced into selling a kidney to pay for his grandmother's cancer treatment. James Wright, a military veteran whose organs had been harvested during what he'd been told was routine surgery at a VA hospital. Lucy Chen, another Chen, apparently was a popular name, a college student whose parents had sold her liver lobe without her knowledge to pay for her brother's medical school. We formed an unlikely support group, bound together by shared trauma and a determination to ensure that what had happened to us wouldn't happen to others. We called ourselves the Survivors Circle, and we met weekly in the basement of a community center, sharing stories and strategies and the kind of healing that only comes from being understood by people who've walked the same impossible path.
Dr. Chen, my Dr. Chen, the therapist who'd helped me navigate the darkest period of my life, told me that helping other survivors was part of my own healing process. When we transform our pain into purpose, when we use our suffering to prevent others from suffering, we reclaim power over our own stories, she said during one of our sessions. She was right. For the first time since waking up in that hospital bed to discover my missing kidney, I felt like I had agency in my own life. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an advocate, a voice for the voiceless, a person whose trauma had been transformed into a weapon against the kind of exploitation that thrived in shadows and silence. The legal proceedings moved slowly, as legal proceedings always do, but the FBI's investigation was thorough and relentless. Victoria Hartwell was charged with human trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering, and a dozen other federal crimes. The doctors who'd performed illegal surgeries were arrested. The brokers who'd facilitated organ sales were being hunted across international borders. And my mother finally called. It was a Tuesday evening in late fall, the kind of night when the air carries the promise of winter and the city settles into its quieter rhythms. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on my phone screen, but something, curiosity maybe, or the hope that trauma might have taught her something about accountability, made me pick up. Elena? Her voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of the dramatic authority that had once dominated our household. Mija, I've been watching the news. I've been seeing what you've done, how you've been fighting. What do you want, Mom? I want to apologize. I want to tell you that I was wrong, that I was desperate and scared, and I made choices that I can never take back. I want you to know that every day since then I've hated myself for what I did to you. The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to rebuild some version of the relationship that had been destroyed by her betrayal.
But a larger part of me remembered waking up in that hospital bed, remembered the months of harassment and fear, remembered the fact that she'd been willing to sacrifice my body to solve problems she and my father had created. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But appreciation isn't the same thing as forgiveness, and forgiveness isn't the same thing as reconciliation." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing across the distance between us. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of what you've done. You've turned something horrible into something meaningful. You've helped people." "I've helped people by making sure that what you did to me never happens to anyone else." "I know, and that's exactly what you should do." Her voice broke slightly, and I heard the sound of tears that I wasn't sure I believed. "I love you, Elena. I'll always love you, but I understand if you can't love me back." After she hung up, I sat in my apartment for a long time, thinking about love and forgiveness, and the difference between understanding someone's motivations and excusing their actions. My mother had been desperate, had made an impossible choice under impossible circumstances, but she'd also violated my body, stolen my agency, and put me in danger that I was still navigating months later.
Maybe someday I would forgive her. Maybe someday I would understand that desperation could drive people to unthinkable acts without excusing those acts. But not yet. Not while I was still rebuilding my life from the wreckage of her choices. Outside my window, the city hummed with its endless rhythms of hope and struggle, love and loss, people making choices that would echo through generations. Somewhere in that city, other families were facing their own impossible decisions. Other young people were vulnerable to exploitation by those who saw human bodies as commodities. But now they had advocates. Now they had voices. Now they had a group of survivors who understood that the best revenge against those who would steal your body is to reclaim your voice and use it to protect others. The work was just beginning, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 5 years after Victoria Hartwell was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, I stood before a Senate subcommittee on healthcare fraud, my voice steady as I testified about the need for stronger regulations on organ transplant networks. The committee room was smaller than I had expected, more intimate than the grand chambers I'd seen in movies, but the weight of the moment felt enormous nonetheless. "Senator Martinez, members of the committee," I began, my hands folded calmly on the witness table despite the storm of memories threatening to overwhelm me. "My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm here today not just as a survivor of organ trafficking, but as the executive director of the Survivor Circle Foundation, an organization that has helped over 300 victims of medical exploitation find justice and healing." In the gallery behind me, I could feel the presence of other survivors who'd made the trip to Washington. Maria Santos, whose son was now in his 3rd year of medical school, determined to become the kind of doctor who protects vulnerable patients rather than exploiting them. James Wright, who'd used his settlement money to start a nonprofit that provided legal aid to veterans facing medical fraud. Lucy Chen, who'd become a nurse practitioner specializing in trauma recovery. The past 5 years had transformed all of us in ways we couldn't have imagined. The Survivor Circle had grown from a small support group meeting in a community center basement to a nationally recognized advocacy organization with offices in 12 cities. We'd helped pass legislation in 8 states requiring stricter consent protocols for organ donation. We'd trained law enforcement agencies on recognizing signs of medical trafficking. We'd provided counseling and legal support to hundreds of families who'd been victimized by predatory medical practices. My own life had been rebuilt from the ground up, piece by careful piece. After the legal settlements were finalized, both from the Hartwell estate and from the various medical facilities involved in the trafficking network, I'd been able to quit my job at Mel's and focus full-time on advocacy work. The diner remained a second home, though, a place where I still stopped by for coffee and conversations with the man who'd stood by me when powerful people were trying to destroy my life.
Dr. Chen had become more than my therapist. She'd become a mentor and eventually a member of our foundation's board of directors. Under her guidance, I'd completed my undergraduate degree in social work and was halfway through a master's program in healthcare administration. My thesis focused on developing protocols for identifying and preventing medical exploitation in immigrant communities. The Elena Vasquez Protection Act that you're considering today would create mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious organ procurement activities and establish federal funding for victim services. But more importantly, it would send a clear message that human bodies are not commodities to be bought and sold. Senator Williams, a Republican from Texas, who'd initially been skeptical of federal involvement in medical regulation, leaned forward with the expression of someone whose mind was being changed in real time. Ms. Vasquez, in your experience, are the protections currently in place adequate to prevent what happened to you from happening to other young people? Absolutely not, Senator. Last month alone, our organization received reports of 4 separate cases where families were approached by brokers offering money for their children's organs. The underground market for human organs is thriving precisely because the legal consequences are minimal and the profits are enormous.
Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The hearing lasted 3 hours, with senators from both parties asking detailed questions about our proposed legislation and the scope of medical trafficking in the United States. When it was over, I felt the familiar exhaustion that came from revisiting my trauma in service of protecting others, but also the satisfaction of knowing that our voices were being heard at the highest levels of government. That evening, at a reception hosted by a coalition of patient advocacy groups, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a transplant surgeon from Johns Hopkins who'd been fighting corruption in organ procurement for decades. She was maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that probably comforted frightened patients and their families. "I've been following your work for years," she told me, sipping wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "What you've accomplished, turning your trauma into such powerful advocacy, it's remarkable." "It's not remarkable," I replied, though I appreciated the sentiment. "It's necessary. When the system fails you, you either work to fix the system or you accept that other people will be failed the same way." "Have you ever considered medical school?" she asked, and the question caught me off guard. With your background in healthcare administration and your deep understanding of patient advocacy, you could be exactly the kind of doctor the medical community needs. Medical school. The idea was both terrifying and intriguing. I'd spent so many years fighting against corrupt doctors that I'd never considered becoming one myself. But Dr. Rodriguez was right. Who better to protect vulnerable patients than someone who'd experienced medical exploitation firsthand? "I'm 32 years old," I said. "Isn't that too old to start medical school?" She laughed, the kind of warm sound that probably helped nervous residents feel more confident during their training. "Elena, I went to medical school at 35 after spending a decade as a social worker. Some of the best doctors I know are second-career physicians who bring life experience and perspective that you can't get from textbooks." The conversation planted a seed that grew over the following months. I began researching medical schools, taking prerequisite courses online, and shadowing doctors who worked with trauma survivors. The more I learned about medicine, the more I understood how my unique background could serve patients who'd been failed by a system that too often prioritized profit over people. 2 years later, I was accepted to the University of Chicago Medical School with a full scholarship funded by an endowment established by several of the Survivors Circle board members. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same day of the week when Marcus Rivera's article had first exposed the Hartwell trafficking network. Cosmic coincidence or karmic justice? I wasn't sure, but the symmetry felt meaningful.
Medical school was brutal in all the ways I'd been warned about, and beautiful in ways I hadn't expected. Learning anatomy meant understanding my own body in ways that helped me process the trauma of what had been stolen from me. Studying pharmacology gave me insights into how I'd been drugged and sedated without my knowledge. But most importantly, clinical rotations showed me how medicine could be practiced with compassion and integrity. How doctors could be advocates for their patients rather than predators who exploited them.
During my surgery rotation, I worked with Dr. Patricia Martinez. No relation to the senator, just another of those cosmic name coincidences. A transplant surgeon who dedicated her career to ethical organ procurement. She taught me about the careful protocols that legitimate transplant programs followed, the extensive counseling and consent processes that protected both donors and recipients. Every organ transplant is a sacred trust, she told me during one of our late-night conversations in the hospital break room. Someone makes the incredibly generous decision to give a piece of themselves to save another person's life. Our job is to honor that generosity, to make sure it's truly voluntary and fully informed. I thought about my stolen kidney often during those rotations, wondering about the person who'd received it, hoping they'd lived a good life with the organ that had been taken from me without consent. Richard Hartwell had died because his body rejected the kidney that was never truly his, but somewhere in the world, there might be another person living with a piece of me, someone who'd received it through legitimate channels after his death. The thought didn't make me angry anymore. If anything, it gave me hope that something positive had emerged from the violation I'd experienced, that the organs stolen from me had ultimately saved a life, even if it hadn't saved the right one. In my 4th year of medical school, I did a research project on consent protocols in vulnerable populations, working with immigrant communities to develop culturally sensitive approaches to medical decision-making. The work brought me full circle to my origins as an advocate, but now I had medical training to complement my lived experience. Dr. Chen, my therapist, Dr. Chen, who guided me through the darkest period of my life, attended my medical school graduation, tears streaming down her face as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. "I always knew you'd find a way to transform your pain into purpose," she told me afterward, "but I never imagined you'd become a doctor." "Neither did I admitted, fingering the diploma that represented 4 years of the hardest work I'd ever done. But sometimes life takes you places you never planned to go. My residency was in emergency medicine at a public hospital that served primarily low-income and immigrant communities. It was exactly where I wanted to be, treating patients who reminded me of my younger self, vulnerable, afraid, often exploited by systems they didn't understand. I became known as the resident who spoke perfect Spanish, who understood the cultural barriers that prevented people from seeking medical care, who could recognize signs of abuse and exploitation that other doctors might miss. During my 2nd year of residency, I was treating a 19-year-old woman named Esperanza, who had been brought to the emergency room by her family with severe abdominal pain. Her symptoms didn't match any obvious diagnosis, but something about her presentation, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her family answered questions for her, the fresh surgical scar she tried to hide, triggered all my instincts about medical exploitation. "Esperanza," I said, gently, after I'd asked her family to step out of the room, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened. All of it. I promise you're safe here." The story that emerged was horrifyingly familiar. A clinic in Tijuana, family members desperate for money, a procedure she'd been told was something else entirely. But this time, I was the doctor. This time, I had the training and authority to ensure she got proper medical care and to report the crime to the appropriate authorities.
"Doctor," she whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength, "will I be okay?" "You'll be okay," I promised, meaning it in ways that went beyond her immediate medical needs, "and we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else."
That night, I called Marcus Rivera, who was now an investigative reporter for a major newspaper and had won 3 journalism awards for his continued coverage of medical trafficking networks. Together, we began unraveling another criminal enterprise, another network of people who saw human bodies as sources of profit rather than as sacred vessels deserving of respect and protection. The work continued, case by case, patient by patient, story by story. Each person we helped represented a small victory against the forces that had once tried to reduce me to spare parts. Each criminal network we exposed meant fewer families would face the impossible choices that had destroyed mine. On quiet nights during my residency, when the emergency room was temporarily calm and I had a few minutes to think, I'd touch the scar on my side where my kidney used to be. It no longer felt like a mark of violation. It had become a reminder of resilience, a symbol of survival, a battle scar earned in a war I was still fighting, but finally seemed to be winning. My mother and I had begun speaking again, slowly and carefully, like 2 people learning a language neither of us was fluent in. She'd spent the years since my trauma in therapy, working to understand how desperation had led her to make choices that violated everything she claimed to believe about love and protection. Our relationship would never be what it had been. Too much trust had been shattered, too much damage done. But we were finding a way to coexist in the same world, to care about each other from a safe distance. "I watch you on the news sometimes," she told me during one of our rare phone calls, "when you're testifying before Congress or speaking at conferences. I'm proud of what you've become, even though I know I have no right to take any credit for it." "You don't," I agreed, but without the anger that had once sharpened those words. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can both live with the truth of what happened without letting it destroy what's left of our family. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something like peace. The kind of complicated, imperfect peace that allows people to move forward without pretending the past hadn't happened.
This was once the headquarters of one of the city's most prestigious medical foundations. The doctors who worked here were respected members of the medical community. They published papers in prestigious journals, spoke at international conferences, and received awards for their contributions to transplant medicine. They were also running one of the largest organ trafficking operations in North American history. A ripple of uncomfortable shifting went through the audience. These students had probably never considered that respected medical institutions could be covers for criminal enterprises, that the white coats and diplomas they aspired to could be used to legitimize the exploitation of vulnerable people. "I'm here today as both a physician and a survivor," I continued, touching the scar on my side that had become my trademark, the physical reminder that authenticated every speech I gave. 15 years ago, I was a college student whose kidney was stolen and sold without my knowledge or consent. Today, I'm an emergency medicine physician who specializes in identifying and treating victims of medical trafficking. The story took an hour to tell in full, with questions and discussion woven throughout. I talked about the medical details, how organs are harvested, how black market transplants are performed, how victims are identified and groomed. I discussed the legal frameworks that had emerged in response to cases like mine, the international efforts to combat organ trafficking, the ongoing challenges of protecting vulnerable populations. But mostly I talked about the human cost, the families destroyed by desperation and greed, the victims who spent years learning to trust medical professionals again, the donors who survived physical healing but struggled with psychological trauma, the recipients who lived with organs obtained through violence, often without knowing the true source of their life-saving transplants. "Dr. Vasquez," asked a student in the 3rd row, her voice tentative but thoughtful, "how do you reconcile working in medicine after what was done to you by medical professionals?" It was a question I'd been asked hundreds of times over the years, and the answer had evolved as I'd grown into my role as both doctor and advocate. "I work in medicine because of what was done to me, not in spite of it. Every patient I treat might be vulnerable to exploitation. Every family facing a medical crisis might be desperate enough to make choices that seem impossible.
My job is to make sure they get legitimate medical care and real informed consent, not predatory offers disguised as medical treatment. After the lecture, I was approached by Dr. Michael Thompson, the Dean of Medical Ethics, a man whose textbooks had shaped medical education for decades. He was maybe 70, with white hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect, even in a profession full of people accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Elena, your presentation was extraordinary," he said, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the faculty lounge. "I have a proposition for you. We're developing a new curriculum on medical trafficking and exploitation. We need someone to head up the program, someone who combines clinical expertise with lived experience. Would you consider joining our faculty?" The offer was tempting in ways I hadn't expected. Harvard Medical School represented the pinnacle of medical education, the kind of institution that could amplify my advocacy work and reach thousands of future doctors. But it also felt like a departure from the community-based medicine that had defined my career, the work with vulnerable populations who couldn't afford to travel to prestigious medical centers. "I'm honored by the offer," I said, "but my work is with patients who need advocates, not with students who'll probably never treat the kind of people I serve." Dr. Thompson smiled, the expression of someone who'd anticipated this response. "What if I told you we're planning to make this curriculum mandatory for all medical students? What if your work here could reach every doctor who graduates from Harvard for the next generation? Think about the ripple effect, Elena. Think about how many patients could be protected by doctors who understand these issues from day one."
The conversation planted another seed, the way my encounter with Dr. Rodriguez had years earlier. Over the following months, I found myself seriously considering the academic position, weighing the benefits of reaching thousands of future doctors against my commitment to direct patient care. The decision was made for me by Esperanza, the 19-year-old patient whose kidney had been stolen in a scenario eerily similar to my own. She'd become one of my regular patients, coming to the emergency room for follow-up care and eventually becoming involved with the survivors circle. During one of our conversations, she said something that changed my perspective entirely. "Dr. Vasquez, you saved my life not just medically, but in every way that matters. But what if there were 100 doctors like you? What if every emergency room had someone who knew how to recognize what happened to us?" She was right. My impact as a single doctor, no matter how dedicated, was limited to the patients I could personally treat. But if I could train hundreds of doctors to recognize and respond to medical exploitation, the impact would be exponential. I accepted the position at Harvard Medical School with the understanding that I would continue my clinical work part-time at the community hospital, maintaining my connection to the patient population that had taught me so much about resilience and survival. The transition was more challenging than I anticipated. Academic medicine operated by different rules, with different priorities and different measures of success. My first semester teaching, I developed a course called Medical Exploitation and Vulnerable Populations that quickly became one of the most popular electives at the medical school. Students were hungry for practical, real-world training that their traditional coursework didn't provide. They wanted to understand how to identify signs of abuse, how to navigate reporting requirements, how to provide trauma-informed care to patients who'd been victimized by the very medical system they were being trained to join. The course evolved over the years, incorporating case studies from around the world, guest lectures from survivors and advocates, and practical training and interview techniques for vulnerable patients. Other medical schools began adopting similar curricula, and I found myself traveling to conferences and workshops, training trainers who would carry this knowledge to even more institutions. Meanwhile, the Survivor Circle continued to grow and evolve. What had started as a support group for organ trafficking victims had expanded to include survivors of all forms of medical exploitation. Patients who'd been subjected to unnecessary procedures for profit, families who'd been coerced into expensive treatments, immigrants who'd been experimented on without proper consent. Maria Santos, my fellow survivor who'd become one of my closest friends and colleagues, had completed her law degree and now served as the foundation's legal director. She'd developed a reputation as one of the country's leading experts on medical trafficking law, arguing cases before federal courts and helping to draft legislation that strengthened protections for vulnerable patients. Elena, do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found each other? If we'd all just tried to heal in isolation instead of coming together to fight back? I thought about it often, actually. The power of collective action. The way shared trauma could become shared strength when people refuse to suffer in silence. Our individual stories of exploitation had been horrific, but together they'd become a powerful narrative about resilience and resistance that had changed laws and saved lives. I think we would have survived, but we wouldn't have thrived. And we definitely wouldn't have been able to protect other people the way we have.
The numbers supported that assessment. In the 15 years since Victoria Hartwell's arrest, federal prosecutions for medical trafficking had increased by 400%. Legislation inspired by our advocacy had been enacted in 37 states. Medical schools across the country now required coursework on recognizing and preventing exploitation. Most importantly, the reporting network we'd helped establish had identified and stopped hundreds of cases before victims could be harmed. But the work was far from over. Global organ trafficking remained a multi-billion-dollar industry, fueled by the same factors that had made my family vulnerable: poverty, desperation, and the willingness of wealthy people to exploit those vulnerabilities for their own benefit. New technologies created new opportunities for exploitation, while economic inequality ensured a steady supply of desperate families willing to consider impossible choices. During my 5th year at Harvard, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker named David Kim, who wanted to tell the complete story of the organ trafficking network we'd helped expose. The film, tentatively titled The Price of Flesh, would follow several survivors from their initial trauma through their advocacy work, showing how individual stories of victimization had become a movement for a systemic change. I want people to understand that this isn't just a crime story, David explained during our first meeting. It's a story about how ordinary people can fight back against systems that seem too powerful to challenge. It's about transformation and resilience and the possibility of justice. The documentary project took 3 years to complete, with filming in multiple countries and interviews with dozens of survivors, advocates, law enforcement officials, and medical professionals. When it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, I sat in the darkened theater, watching my own story unfold on the big screen, marveling at how far I'd traveled from that terrified young woman who'd woken up in a hospital bed missing a kidney. The film won several awards and was eventually distributed to Netflix, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. More importantly, it sparked renewed public interest in medical trafficking issues and led to increased funding for survivor services and law enforcement efforts. One of the most powerful moments in the documentary was an interview with Dr. Patricia Martinez, my former mentor from medical school, who'd become one of the leading voices in ethical transplant medicine. She said, "Elena Vasquez represents everything that's right about medicine. She took unimaginable trauma and transformed it into a force for healing and protection. She embodies the physician's oath to first do no harm in ways that go far beyond traditional medical practice." The documentary's success led to speaking opportunities I'd never imagined. I addressed the United Nations General Assembly about global organ trafficking, testified before the European Parliament about strengthening international cooperation on medical crimes, and spoke at the World Health Organization's annual conference about protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. Each platform allowed me to reach new audiences, to plant seeds that might grow into stronger protections for vulnerable people around the world. But the work that mattered most remained the same: identifying victims, supporting survivors, and training the next generation of medical professionals to recognize and respond to exploitation. 20 years after my kidney was stolen, I stood in the same hospital where I'd first learned about the theft,
now serving as the Director of Medical Ethics and Advocacy. The institution had transformed itself in response to the scandals that had emerged from our work, implementing some of the strongest patient protection protocols in the country. Dr. Martinez, the original Dr. Martinez who delivered the devastating news about my missing kidney, had retired years earlier, but we'd maintained a relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing similar tragedies. He'd become one of my strongest supporters, often saying that my survival and success had restored his faith in medicine's potential for good. You know, he told me during his retirement party, "When I first met you, I thought your story was one of the most horrible things I'd ever encountered in medicine. But watching what you've done with that experience, how you've used it to protect other people, it's made me understand that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the most important work we'll ever do."
He was right, though the journey from victim to advocate to physician to educator had been longer and more complicated than anyone could have predicted. There had been setbacks and frustrations, moments when the scope of global exploitation felt overwhelming, times when I questioned whether individual efforts could make meaningful difference against such powerful systems of abuse. But there had also been victories. Patients saved from exploitation because a doctor recognized warning signs I'd helped develop. Families protected from predatory medical offers because of legislation we'd helped pass. Medical students who graduated with understanding of their ethical obligations that went far beyond what previous generations had received. Most importantly, there had been healing, not just for me, but for hundreds of survivors who'd found community and purpose through the survivor circle. We'd learned that trauma didn't have to be the end of our stories, that violation could be transformed into empowerment, that the worst things that happened to us didn't have to define everything that came after. On quiet evenings, when the demands of medical practice and advocacy work gave way to personal reflection, I sometimes thought about the 19-year-old girl I'd been when this all started. She'd been naive in ways that probably saved her life, trusting in ways that made her vulnerable, but also believing in justice and fairness in ways that fueled her eventual resistance. I wished I could tell her that survival was possible, that the kidney that was stolen from her would eventually save more lives through the advocacy it inspired than it ever could have by remaining in her body. I wished I could explain that the mother who betrayed her would eventually become someone capable of real remorse and partial redemption, that forgiveness was possible even when reconciliation wasn't complete. But mostly, I wished I could tell her that her voice mattered, that her story would eventually become part of a larger narrative about the power of ordinary people to challenge systems of exploitation and abuse. That the worst thing that ever happened to her would ultimately become the foundation for the most meaningful work she'd ever do. The kidney I'd lost was gone forever, but in its place had grown something more valuable, the knowledge that my body belonged to me, that my voice had power, that my experience could be transformed into protection for others. It was a trade I'd never wanted to make, but having been forced into it, I'd learned to be grateful for what I'd gained, even while mourning what I'd lost. As I looked toward the future, I could see new challenges emerging, technological advances that created new opportunities for exploitation, economic inequality that ensured a steady supply of vulnerable people, global systems that prioritize profit over human dignity. But I could also see a new generation of advocates and medical professionals who understood these issues in ways their predecessors never had, who'd been trained to recognize and respond to exploitation from the beginning of their careers. The work would continue, patient by patient, student by student, story by story. And somewhere in that future, fewer families would face the impossible choices mine had confronted. Fewer young people would wake up in hospital beds to discover pieces of themselves had been stolen. Fewer survivors would have to rebuild their lives from the wreckage of medical betrayal. That future was worth fighting for, worth dedicating a lifetime to achieving. It was the legacy I wanted to leave, the ripple effect that would extend far beyond my own story into a world where human dignity was protected and medical care was truly about healing rather than exploitation. My kidney was gone, but my voice remained, and that voice, amplified by the voices of other survivors and the doctors we'd trained and the laws we'd helped pass, was growing stronger every day.